Hi, Acadiana. I'm Meteorologist Dave Baker on this Thursday afternoon. Sorry things are running a little bit slower this time around. Was hoping to get this out closer to the 3 o'clock hour, but was kind of waiting for some of the latest computer models as well as the satellite imagery. I remember back when we had Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, there's just so many people that are jamming on to the servers from the National Hurricane Center, the National Weather Service, and NOAA, that a lot of the satellites have been kind of running pretty slow. So I wanted to make sure that I got at least a couple of these to load in so that you got a good view of what's going on. Now, Hurricane Rafael is really kind of overcoming some really unfavorable conditions. In fact, we really thought that it had peaked once it made its way on land of Cuba, and then it kind of emerged off of Cuba with winds at 105, and then it dropped off a little bit to 100. But this afternoon, we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence here, and those wind speeds are back to 105 miles per hour. There is a look at where Rafael is right now in the Gulf of Mexico, and it is continuing more of a west-northwesterly track. There's also a bit of a tropical type of disturbed weather area there over the northeastern Caribbean that has at least a little bit of a slight chance for some development down around, I think it's around 20% from the National Hurricane Center. But there's a couple of things that we are watching, and I wanted to kind of give you an idea, not just where Hurricane Rafael is, which obviously it's right there, but there are a couple of other players that are going to come into the steering of where this is going to go. And the first one is a pretty big ridge of high pressure that's over the Atlantic, and it is forecast to kind of back build here back to the west a little bit. So that should kind of build just north of Rafael and continue to keep it here on a westward track. But you've got an upper low that's out here, and believe it or not, they've got a pretty massive snowstorm that's going on across parts of the Four Corner states, Arizona, New Mexico, southern parts of Colorado, the southern Rockies. So it is actually transitioning to fall and winter across parts of the United States. Unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to want to come to Louisiana, as we are still dealing with some very warm and humid conditions here locally, and most of us are seeing a mix of sun and clouds and temperatures in the 80s. But here's a look at the Atlantic satellite. Again, you've got Rafael there kind of moving between Florida and Cuba and drifting off toward the west. And that other area that I was kind of talking about that the National Hurricane Center's kind of got highlighted is really right about in that area. But there's also kind of an upper low that's a little bit farther toward the south. There's the surface feature, and there's the upper level low that's a little bit farther toward the south. So it's kind of really just trying to get its act together, but that's going to be slow to happen here over the next couple of days. So let's just go ahead and focus on Rafael. And you can see there that the eye is still fairly well defined. And earlier today, the reconnaissance aircraft found kind of an opening in the southwest side. So it was starting to pull in some drier air. And of course, tropical systems don't like to pull dry air into the center because that's usually one of the indications that you're going to see some weakening. But things looks like they've now closed off. And even though it's going to be working westward into a very dry part of an air mass there in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico, which is relatively unfavorable, it seems that Rafael wants to overcome some of that unfavorability there in the central part of the Gulf. So there might be a little bit more strengthening coming up overnight tonight. That's at least some of the talk from the National Hurricane Center this time around. But then it should start to weaken as it moves a little bit farther toward the west. Now, where's it going to go after that? We're going to talk a little bit about that right here. So the official forecast for the National Hurricane Center keeps it a hurricane really going into the mid part of the weekend, and maybe starting to see some weakening as we get into Sunday and Monday. But it looks like it's going to hold its own here. Those winds right now at 105, 24.7 north and 86.2 west, and the pressure dropping from 971 to 968. So we do have a little bit of a decrease in that pressure right now. But look at all the hurricane models. Remember earlier when it was just about ready to make its way to Cuba, those first 3 days were pretty rock on. But as you go out a little bit farther out in the forecast, they're going all over the place. We've got some models that are curving it to the south. We've got some models that are kind of drifting it northward and then kind of shooting it out to the east. That would be if the trough that's over the desert southwest can open up and move a little bit farther to the east. The more westward and southwestward would be if the ridge of high pressure that's over the Atlantic would win this battle. And then you've got a couple of them that really kind of make the loop-de-loop here. It may start to turn a little bit farther to the north in response to that trough that's over the Four Corner states. And then farther down in the forecast, the ridge of high pressure that's east might start to win. So you could see that loop around and come back around down toward the south. So as of now, it looks like any impacts that we would have for the Acadiana region would end up being mainly on the coast and in the offshore waters. And they are probably going to start to post some small craft advisories for our local waters. They've already got some small craft advisories up for the southeastern part of the state. Intensity models are keeping this as a category 2, at least for the next 24 hours, and then some weakening, but you can also see that there are a couple of models that show maybe a little bit of strengthening here, getting back up to category 3. It wouldn't have too far to go. Those winds would have to get up to 115 miles per hour, really 111. But so we might see a little bit of strengthening here in the next 24 hours. The bulk of the models are staying category 2 and then starting to see that weakening coming up as we get out to a day and a half to 2 days, at 48-hour period. And then again, if it starts to move into the western part of the Gulf of Mexico, the conditions are going to be a lot more unfavorable. And that's what a lot of the models here are starting to pinpoint. Most of them are going back down into tropical storm status, while a few of them are kind of hanging it on as a category 1 hurricane. And then eventually it's either going to wash out or it should reach land. And right now, if it's got any impact on land, the best 2 chances are going to be the southwestern Gulf of Mexico on the Mexican coastline. But again, I got a couple of global models that might have it weaken to a tropical storm and perhaps turn back toward the north. But at this point, those models that turn it more toward the north, there's a lot less of them going with that scenario and a lot more of them kind of turning it back toward the Bay of Campeche. Now, because of where Hurricane Rafael is right now, the tropical storm force winds and the hurricane force winds are going to stay well out into the Gulf of Mexico. But there's still going to be a little chance that we could see some tropical storm force winds getting into some of our offshore waters, and some of our friends that work on the oil platforms might be seeing some of those stronger winds here as we get into Friday and the weekend. And as far as the coastal areas, again, tides might be running a little bit higher. You could see some minor coastal flooding, and also some rough seas and some rough winds. So boating is not going to be recommended, especially for small craft, as we head into the weekend. So that's really, I think, going to be the biggest impact to here in Acadiana. So let's go with the HWRF. And again, we're going to start with the 2 hurricane-specific models. And the HWRF was kind of the first one to kind of grab onto this westerly track and keep it away from the northern Gulf Coast. So the HWRF through Tuesday has it drifting off to the west, running into a more hostile environment, maybe stalling a little bit there over the central part of the Gulf of Mexico, and then eventually just kind of washing out as we get into Tuesday of next week. The HAFS model has a little bit more intensification here in the next 24 hours, but then you can see, just like the HWRF, maybe a southward turn, hostile environment, but then there's that little blip there of maybe it can get over some warmer waters and perhaps could get some lower wind shear there in that very last couple of frames. That would be on Tuesday, but notice it's a much more southward track heading toward the Mexican coastline. The GFS still has a bit of a pull from the trough that comes in from the desert southwest, and the GFS hasn't changed a whole lot, although the earlier morning run had it kind of lift northward and then loop around and then kind of come back down toward the south. So again, that's going to be the battle between that trough in the west that could open up and move off to the east, or perhaps the ridge of high pressure that's over here over the Atlantic Ocean here might be able to push its way off toward the west. So you got the low out to the west and the ridge to the east. And on this particular model, as you go out beyond 5 days, it almost looks like that this low might kind of loop around. So I think it might be tugged by the low pressure area over the west, and then eventually high pressure that's to the east would win the battle. And that's why you're kind of getting that loop-de-loop there with the GFS. The Euro model continues on more of a westerly track, but you see a little bit of a pull just to the north there As the trough goes on by, and then kind of like the GFS, high pressure that's over the Atlantic Ocean eventually wins the battle and kind of shoves it off toward the west. So there's that trough coming in. You see a little bit of a northward turn, then kind of a stall, and then high pressure over here wins the battle and shoves it off toward the southwest. So that would be a decent scenario for everybody, because the weakening with the Euro model is even going down toward the southwest, toward the Mexican coast, would be beneficial for just about everybody who lives across the Gulf of Mexico. Canadian model still pulls this thing up into the Louisiana coastline, but it doesn't seem to really get grabbed by the trough anymore. And you get kind of a push off toward the east, kind of running in tandem with that trough. But the Canadian model has been kind of off from the rest of the models that we've seen over the past several days. And the Icon model does get a little bit of a tug back to the north, and then that ridge of high pressure eventually would win out as we get into the 5 or 6 day time period. So there's a possibility that we could see more of a loop according to the Icon model. And I'm kind of looking here at some of the extended frames that go out to 120 hours, which would be 5 days. And I'm going to go ahead and get that image saved so we can kind of compare that to the rest of them here. So that's what we're going to look at as we compare the 4 models. So we're going to go out to Tuesday. And remember, the GFS kind of had it pulling close to the northern Gulf Coast and then kind of looping back around once we got beyond Tuesday. The Euro model also had a slight turn toward the north and then looped around and comes back toward the southwest, toward the Mexican coastline. And this is again Tuesday. And the Canadian model on Tuesday is really got it being absorbed by the trough, and then some rain just kind of running along the northern Gulf Coast. And this is the 5-day outlook for the Icon model. And as we saw in the animation, the Icon model was very similar to the GFS and the Euro. You get that westerly track. It starts to get tugged a little bit by the trough coming out here. And then the ridge of high pressure starts to win out, and it kind of loops its way back around and starts heading off toward the south. So at this point, it still looks like we're not going to see really any impacts here, other than the coastal areas having some higher than average tides and also some very gusty winds in the offshore waters. It could tap into a little moisture as the trough out west opens up and starts to push to the east, and that could just bring us some additional rainfall continuing into the early part of the week. We're already expecting some rainfall to come back into play on Saturday and Sunday, but that's really because that trough will be opening up out to the west. Doesn't really tap into the tropical moisture, but if we can tap into that into Monday and Tuesday, we might be able to extend our rainy period there. Although I know that we had the long string of dry days, but these last several days we've had quite a bit of rain. So if we can just switch back to dry and cool, that would be something very nice. Real quick, wanted to show you the water temperatures. They are warm enough over most of the Gulf of Mexico to sustain tropical activity, but the tropical cyclone heat potential really does drop off a lot in the western part of the Gulf. Therefore, I think that we would still see some weakening. And the same goes with the wind shear right now. It's still in a fairly low wind shear environment, and that might be why it's overcoming some of the cooler waters and some of the dry air and continuing to strengthen a little bit. But as we get into the early part of next week, if it starts to lift northward or even in the western part of the Gulf of Mexico, it's going to encounter a lot of that wind shear, and more than likely it should weaken. So I will say we're in pretty good agreement with what's going to happen today, tomorrow, and probably Saturday. But then after that, I still think we might need to watch it. I don't think it's going to be a threat to us, but we'll still watch it in case we see that low that's out in the west kind of win the battle and try to pull it back off toward the north. But right now, that doesn't seem like a likely situation, but it is something that we'll watch from model run to model run, because there is a lot of uncertainty. And part of that is because it's November. We don't normally have tropical systems in the western or northern part of the Gulf of Mexico during the month of November. And the models are using data going all the way back in history. And if there aren't too many examples of tropical systems in the Gulf of Mexico in November, that's not going to be able to be pulled into a lot of the model data. So like we have in the summertime, you get a lot of agreement once you start getting the hurricane reconnaissance data in there. But because this is something that's a lot more unprecedented, not only are meteorologists having an issue with it, but also some of the computer models too. So just going to have to watch it very, very closely here over the next couple of days. Also wanted to point out the global tropics hazard outlook is showing that maybe hurricane season could continue to go. There might be a Sebastian in the future. I don't know if it's going to be that tropical wave that's north of Puerto Rico right now. It could be something else because week 3 of the global tropics hazard outlook is still keeping activity a little bit higher there in the western part of the Caribbean and the far western Atlantic, which, by the way, is the most likely area that you would have tropical development during the month of November. And we still get some systems in November, and believe it or not, sometimes we get a couple of them that will cruise their way into December as well. But hurricane season officially ends on November the 30th. Let's hope it shuts down before we get there. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like it, subscribe to my channel, turn on the notifications. And by the way, thank you for bearing with me. Over the last 3 days, I've been doing 2 of these Let's Talk Tropics through the day. Had a great 3 days of high school swimming championships over at the Robichaux Center. We got the top 16 that's going to be coming up on Saturday. Really excited. It's my favorite meet of the year. But I like to work those meets, and that's why I did the morning and the evening one. That way I could still be able to support those high school kids and watch all these great races that we have seen over the past couple of days. But tomorrow there is no meet, so I will be back with Let's Talk Tropics live at noon. And also, listen to my forecasts on Big 102.1, Planet Radio 106.7, and Freedom 95.1. And of course, you can always follow my social media pages, both on Facebook and X. I'm meteorologist Dave Baker. Have a great afternoon. I'll have another update on Rafael at 9 o'clock later tonight. There are no warnings that are in effect or watches, so rather than getting updates every 3 hours, we will now get them every 6 hours. So 9 o'clock is when the next update will be, and I will have that on my social media pages. Have a great afternoon. I'll see you on Friday.